Hello, and welcome to this reading of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in 1843 and has been called the man who invented Christmas. Perhaps he's not the man who invented Christmas, but the man who rebirthed the meaning and the heart of Christmas. He wrote it in the middle of the Industrial Revolution in 1843 when the wheels of progress were rolling over the humanities. His words spoke to the souls of its readers. Dickens changed society. Charitable giving by individuals skyrocketed. Christmas traditions, long out of fashion, such as gift-giving, singing, parties, and the Christmas tree, became institutions. Over 175 years later, the words still speak to our hearts. Dickens also created a shortened version of A Christmas Carol that he personally read to groups and to clubs. It maintains the essence of the true meaning of Christmas. I've edited a few sentences here and there, but it's all Dickens. And so I read to you A Christmas Carol. First, a foreword by Charles Dickens. I have endeavored in this ghostly little book to raise a ghost of an idea, which shall not be put my readers out of humor with themselves or with each other, with the season or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly. C.D. or Charles Dickens. Chapter 1. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. There was no doubt about that. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name, however, and yet it stood for years afterwards above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, was Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. No one ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you?" No beggars employed him to bestow a trifle. Once upon a time, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather, and the city blocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. Once upon a time, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was a cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather, and the city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep an eye on his clock in a dismal little cell beyond. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clock's fire was so much smaller that it looked like one coal. Wheretofore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at a candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation Scrooge had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! If I had my will, every idiot who goes about with a Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake through his heart. He should!" Uncle, I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, apart from the veneration due to its sacred origin, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket. I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it. The clerk and the tank involuntarily applauded. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge. as if this were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." His nephew left the room without an angry word. The clerk, in letting in Scrooge's nephew out, had let two gentlemen in. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" said one of the gentlemen, referring to a list. "Mr. Marley died 7 years ago, this very night." "At this festive occasion, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and the destitute, sir. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and the workhouses. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." "Many would rather die." "If they would rather die, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. "You want all day tomorrow off, I suppose?" "It's only once a year, sir." "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Well, be here all the earlier the next morning." Scrooge took his melancholy dinner and went home to bed. He lived in a gloomy suite of rooms which had once belonged to his deceased partner. Now it is a fact that there is nothing about the knocker on the door of his house that was particularly unique, except that it was a very large knocker. And Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. And yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock on the door, saw in the knocker not a knocker, but Marley's face. As Scrooge looked at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He said, "Pah!" and closed the door with a sound like thunder. Quite satisfied, he locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secure against surprise, he sat down before the very low fire to take his gruel. A glance happened to rest on a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated, for some purpose now forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It began to swing. Soon it swang out loudly, and so every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cell below. Though the heavy door, a spectre passed into the room before his eyes. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Now," said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever, "what do you want with me?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" "I can. Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because a little thing affects them, a slight disorder of the stomach that makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more than gravy about you than grave, wherever you are." "Hear me! My time is nearly gone. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping my fate. A chance and a hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You will be haunted by 3 spirits." Jacob, I'd rather not." "Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1." It walked towards him, and then walked backward, and with every step the window raised a little, so that when the apparition reached it, it was wide open. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked, and the bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable and fell asleep in an instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was dark, and the church clock rolled a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy one. Light flashed upon the room in an instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man. Its hair was white, yet its face had not a wrinkle on it. It held a branch of fresh holly in its hand, yet its dress was trimmed with summer flowers. But by the strangest thing, to the crown upon his head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all was visible. "Who and what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past. Rise and walk." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted. "Bear but a touch of my hand here," said the spirit, laying upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood on the busy thoroughfares of the city. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here and there it was Christmas time. "Good heaven!" said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked. "I was in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit touched him on the arm, and Scrooge was in a room where the boy Scrooge knew to be his younger self, reading along. A door opened, and a little girl much younger than the boy came darting in, and putting her arms about his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as, "My dear, dear brother." "I've come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clapping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan?" replied the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimming with glee. "Home for the good of all, home forever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That home is like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night that he was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home, and he said, 'Yes, you should,' and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man," said the child, "and you are never to come back here, but first we are to be together in Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world." "You're quite a woman, little Fan," said the boy. "Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost. "But she had such a large heart." "Yes, she did," cried Scrooge. "You're right. I'll not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid." "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children." "One child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew." Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, "Yes." Though they had but a moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a big city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled their way, and all their strife and tumult of a real city were. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it? I was apprenticed here." They went in, and at the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting at such a high desk, Scrooge cried with great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig rubbed his hands and called out in a jovial voice, "Oh, there, Ebenezer, Dick!" "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Why, my old fellow prentice, oh, bless me, yes." "Yo-ho," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick, Ebenezer. Queer the day, my lads." Every movable was packed off, the floor was swept, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire. In came a fiddler with a music box. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile, and in came the Miss Fezziwigs, the six young followers whose hearts they had broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business, the housemaid. In came the baker, the cook, and the milkman. There were dances, and there were forfeits, and there were cakes, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies, and there was beer. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person, wished them, or him or her, a Merry Christmas. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money." Scrooge felt the spirit's glance. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick!" Again he saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. He sat beside a very young girl in a black dress, whose eyes were full of tears. "Spirit, remove me from this place." "I told you that these were shadows of things that had been, that they are what they are. Do not blame me." As Scrooge looked upon the woman that he had once loved and had rejected, he said, "Remove me. I cannot bear it." As he struggled with the spirit, he was conscious of being exhausted. He barely had time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep.